Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 122nd episode. Today, we will discuss global macro and development multilateralism. Our return guest is Martin Mühleisen, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. Prior to the Council, Martin spent several decades at the International Monetary Fund in various senior capacity, and his last position there was Director for the Department of Strategy, Policy, and Review. Martin Mühleisen, a warm welcome back to Kopi Time.
Thank you, Taimur. It's great to be back, and congratulations on the great run of your show.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you and I did exactly half the number of episodes ago, back when it was like in the 60s.
That's right. Yeah. Although, it doesn't feel that long ago, and we haven't grown that much older, right? It sounds like, back in the 60s.
No, and in fact, you and I met in person just a week ago in Washington, D.C. You were kind enough to take me out to lunch. Martin, let's start with that. Some takeaways from the IMF meetings for you.
Yeah, the IMF meetings. It was a great show, as always. All the tents were erected and the meetings were announced and the words were spoken, but one could not come away from the meetings with the sense of, there isn't really much that people can agree on. And by people, I mean the whole world community. It's not just the two big countries that are kind of, being declared geopolitical, rivals. I mean, I'm talking China and Russia, of course. They would have resisted a lot of the language on the politics, usually ahead of a communique. But also, within Europe, within the development community and the finance community, it's no longer the old multilateralism. There's a lot at stake in various ways, but it doesn't lead to multilateral outcomes. The real show is going on elsewhere, I think. Now, having said that, obviously there was some kind of small steps forward on issues where everybody has an interest. First of all, just before the meeting started, the managing director had been reappointed for another 5 years, which seemed to be a kind of a solution where everybody could agree on, because deviating from it would have been a big mess. And she had a lot of supporters, but it wasn't really unanimous. At least at the beginning. I mean, the IMF always rallies around in the board meetings usually. But there was also some progress on the quota before, of course. It's been a while already that the US agreed. And if you read the communique language, there's a lot of talk about, first of all, we're going to implement this. So the US, obviously, in the crosshairs here, because they need Congress to act. But they were supporting that language, that the actual quota gets legislated and appropriated and then paid in. There was some talk about how to switch between the quota and the arrangements to borrow in case quotas get delayed. So that's all like process, and it's fine that it proceeds. Some other stuff, they're all committed to.
Martin, before you move on, I just want to ask you one question, just for the listeners' understanding. Explain the substance of the quota rearrangement. Does it mean a reduction in the voting power of the United States and European countries, and by extension, an increase in the voting power of emerging market economies?
Yeah, no, so that's the problem when you come out of the spring meetings. You're still stuck with the technicalities. Okay, let's step back. The quota is the IMF's capital, if you want, right? It's the paid-in share capital of each member country, and it also determines the voting power, more or less. What was agreed was not a realignment of quotas, which is a big demand by especially China, also emerging markets. They feel underrepresented at the IMF. Which they are. I mean, factually speaking, the IMF always was supposed to have votes according to the size of its member economies, and China is obviously undervalued at the moment. No, it was instead a commitment by the US to increase its share, or its not its share, but its actual capital. which it did to solidify the finances of the IMF, because a lot of the lending capacity of the IMF is based on arrangements to borrow if needed from member countries. And to make the IMF more stable, the US agreed to raise its capital. Now, it only did that because it got the agreement from everybody else to also raise their capital share, but in the same proportion like the US. So in other words, IMF gets more capital, great, but there's no realignment of votes, not so great, as some will say. Okay, and it's still an important step because it also demonstrates the US commitment to the IMF, but it's only kind of half the issue, and it's kind of surprising that some other countries agreed. But, there we come to this geopolitical thing, because it was a good move. And I think if China had, for example, said, well, we don't agree to this unless we get a bigger vote, they could have been presented as someone who blocked an IMF, kind of a good thing for the fund for their own parochial reasons. And why would they do that? Because the global South needs a lot of money. So the other way around, if the US had done nothing, they could have been accused of just ignoring the plight of these countries. So everybody had an interest to say, well, look, we support more capital for the IMF, so it can lend more. But that was kind of the lowest common denominator. And what I was saying earlier is that now they need to implement that. The Congress needs to legislate the money, other countries obviously too, but it's always the Congress that proves the sticking part. That's how it was in 2010. It took them 6 years, I think, to come around. And then, of course, there's this loose commitment to review the quota shares and the voting shares of the IMF and to find a process forward. Now, I don't want to kind of bring up comparisons to Damocles, but it goes a little bit in that direction, because there are so many interests interwoven into that quota formula they even have, which is kind of a guideline. It's not deterministic, but kind of figuring out the relative kind of standings of various European countries within that quota arrangement, finding out the relative strength of, say, Japan and China, figuring out how much vote to really give the developing countries, although economically speaking, they're so small still, unfortunately, that they're not really way out of line. It's more a political question. So how much votes should Africa have in the IMF? It's a big political issue. And, they just got another board chair. The 25th board chair of the IMF goes to Africa. So they now have 3, which is good, I think. But figuring out how to kind of divide the political and the economic influence and fit it into a formula. If you ask me, they're going to talk about that for ages and not making progress, which means that, China will again probably have to ask itself, do we still support this institution in a few years if nothing happens, or what do we do? So far they've been playing along constructively, but it's heightening the tension between what the IMF really is and what it's supposed to be.
Excellent. Very, very useful. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah. So the quota that, the agreement was some way forward. Now they commit to further process. The common framework, as always, is under debate. So, low income and developing countries are over indebted. There's been problems with countries like Zambia that needed to restructure its debt, and they, took them forever to do that, in part because China, not always China, but often China, was very slow in restructuring. They've been making progress on that one. The interesting thing here is that the IMF came out with a policy paper just before the meeting started. And that's a very technical paper and very difficult to read. I have to warn our listeners about delving into that paper. There's a lot of legalese in there, but it's really important. The issue here is the following. Zambia had to wait for an IMF program for 3 years or so because the creditors could not agree on a restructuring. Under the old kind of rules, if you want, 10, 20 years ago, when China was not yet a big creditor, but there was only the Paris Club, so the advanced industrial economies. Usually agreement in the Paris Club that they would take on this debt restructuring, let alone agree on it yet, was already enough for the IMF to say, okay, we're going to have a deal one day, so we move forward. With China, that didn't work because there was no way of gauging whether China really was serious when they said, well, we're going to engage and we're going to talk. And, it took a lot of years at the beginning. But that was due to, in part, internal issues in China. But I think the international community has come to the point where they said, well, China has now done a few restructurings. They have participated. Not smoothly, mind you. It's still a process with them, but there is something going on with China that we can say, okay, once they say they engage, we're most likely going to get to some point where we have an agreement with them. And that should be enough for the IMF to go forward. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing, that's the assurances policy. And there's a little kind of, a little kind of tool that can threaten China if a country wants to say, well, if China doesn't engage at all or not timely enough, but we've made all efforts to reach out, we made good offers to them, that the IMF can say, well, China, too bad. You're not going to get paid under our IMF program. You have to wait until you come to a debt agreement. In the meantime, the country gets IMF money, but you will not get paid from it. We stop the payments to the country as soon as they even think of repaying you. So in a way, it's defaulting on China, keeping them in default, but the IMF goes ahead, and that is something that used to be just impossible in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. It got changed a little bit when Russia did its first Ukraine thing with the Crimea and the Donbass in 2000. When was it, 15 or 14? It got changed a little bit to open the door slightly to be able to lend to Ukraine. And now it's been even further widened the door. It doesn't mention China, of course. But this so-called policy of lending into official arrears is a big step for the fund. But still, I would see...
For example, in the Ukraine context, Ukraine can default or not service its debt toward Russia, but still receive an IMF program disbursement.
Yeah. So back then, in short, Russia held a 3 billion bond that it had kind of gotten from Ukraine in exchange for money, but under a regime in Ukraine that was still kind of, to Russia's liking. And the Ukrainians, after the change in power and that little green man invasion of Crimea, said, there's no way we're going to pay you. In fact, you caused us so much damage, we're not going to pay you. And the international community said, well, if a creditor like Russia is no longer relevant for program financing in the future, which obviously it wasn't because they had become enemies by then, the IMF can still go ahead while the debt is being sorted out, provided that the country doesn't repay the debt. So, in other words, if Ukraine doesn't pay Russia, we can move ahead. So that was the lending into official arrears policy. And as I said, it has now been widened a little bit further, but it's a very kind of weak leverage against China because it's, tell me which country would like to default on China intentionally, given all the trade links, the financing links, the cross-default clauses, and God knows what.
Exactly.
So it's very unlikely, but it's there as a little tool to be used. But the real issue is the assurances policy. So that's a vote of confidence, if you want, in China, of them playing by the rules, just very slowly. They need to still figure out a lot of the details, and internal coordination is very weak. So the IMF can then faster. So that's, I think, a good move. It's a marginal one. We'll have to see how it works out in the future, but that's one of the achievements of the board before the meetings. We also got some news, I think just yesterday, again, not related to the meetings directly, that the African Development Bank seems to have come to a point with IMF shareholders that they can use SDRs that the fund is issuing to finance, to raise finance that they can on-lend to Africa. So again, that sounds not such a big thing, but it has the seeds of something bigger that gets us deep into development finance. So the issue is that SDRs are being regarded by central banks as reserve currency, right? That's part of the deal of the IMF. As long as the fund is using conditionality for its programs and is able of addressing countries' balance of payments issues, the claims that central banks have on the IMF, because the IMF is financed by member country contributions way back in the 40s, gold, and nowadays currency. So as long as that claim is of a very high quality, the central banks can say, oh, look, it's part of our reserves, okay? Because the IMF owes them SDRs. Now, say if the IMF would hand out SDRs to institutions that are of not such great quality, and those institutions would then lend and make losses, and the IMF would have to at some point record a loss on its books, on its SDRs, that would be passed on to the member countries, and you cannot have losses on central bank reserves, right? It has to be absolutely safe, that asset. So that's the link here. That's so kind of complicated sometimes. The centerpiece here is IMF conditionality. And that's why this RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that the IMF came up with to lend to poorer countries for climate purposes, which was heralded, all around the world as a major step forward. Well, it's actually a fairly small amount. It's big for some island countries, yes, but in the rest of the scheme of things, it's in the bigger scheme, it's not so big. And the reason is because it's all funded on SDR contributions. And those have to be reserves and extra reserves in these trust funds, and the conditionality has to have a full-fledged IMF program, and you get some money from the trust fund. And it's just complicated. It's a big mess bureaucratically, and the outcome is not that great. So the African Development Bank now with a bunch of guarantees from the UK and other countries to do exactly the same, but it doesn't require a full IMF program, because apparently it has sufficient guarantees from other countries to use these SDRs. So that's an unbureaucratic way of proceeding. If it gains followers, it could also apply to others like the LADB and the Asia Development Bank and so forth. And that would open up new ways of financing within limits, I would say still, but it does away with this IMF program requirement that kind of is a conflict of interest for the IMF, really, and just creates unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles. So, I've been going on to explain a lot of this, and I'm sorry. I hope this is interesting for people. But you can see that the devil is in the details, first of all, and second, all these incremental kind of ways of making progress are really because there's no other ways forward. There's no big decision on the voting shares. There's no big decision on, raising lots of money for the World Bank and this. So everybody's trying to tweak the existing system so that something comes out of it and they can claim it as a success.
Right. I think, super helpful, Martin. But at the same time, as you correctly say, these are on the margin. These are not seismic in terms of global development finance or meeting any of the major lumpy needs of the developing world. And going back to the first point in terms of the voice and the quota in these international organizations, certainly that crisis is not being resolved by these incremental changes. Martin, I feel that the April meetings were not that different in terms of communication than the October 2023 meetings in Marrakesh. Although there was one word that was not mentioned at all in those meetings and are mentioned a lot these days, and including in the spring meetings, is the word overcapacity. So the Americans are, looking hard at China's industrial capacity and terming it as overcapacity with the risk of exporting deflation. What do you think of this argument, and where do you think the IMF stands on this?
Well, the argument first. I think it reflects a very different view, a philosophical difference of the role of the state in China, as opposed to a lot of parts of the rest of the world. The private sector is kind of an interesting entity in China, right? Question is whether it ever existed, or it has probably existed for a while, but then the last couple of years they have clamped down quite a bit on entrepreneurs because they saw, first of all, the growth of inequality in China, but I think more importantly, I think the leadership feared that the role of the party was being questioned. And so what I saw is that there was a lot of clamping down on private investment, on private entrepreneurship in the, at least in the finance sector, and to some extent probably elsewhere. Although, don't get me wrong, I mean, obviously you have companies that are fairly independent in China, but I think the overall notion that these kind of operate independently of the party and the state is something that China wouldn't probably subscribe to, as opposed to Western liberal democracies, where you have to have a good reason for the state to interfere with your businesses. So I think China looks at its economy and says, well, it's part of the state, broadly speaking. So what do we do to, first of all, address the big slump that we've been facing because of our housing, our problems, our debt, our demographics? We need to avoid, first of all, social uncertainty and social upheaval. That threatens the rule of the party. And B, we need to prepare, especially given our demographics, for the challenges of the next 10, 20 years. And so they seem to have come to a conclusion that they need to find ways to support what they see as, first of all, key industries, and second, key markets. So it's no accident, I think, that China is doing a lot of business with the global south, as we call it, because that's where the population growth sits over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And it's no kind of surprise that they're trying to boost industries that they think will be critical, like green energy, technology, AI, EVs, if you want. So what happens is that I think China, which is inward, I think, to a degree that we in the West can't really imagine, 1 billion people that are very internally consumed with their own issues, they don't, I think, look so far out. And if the Chinese say, well, we need this, who's going to stop us? And that, of course, brings them into that conflict with the US, who, as you said, thinks this is overcapacity. They're manufacturing their way out of a crisis. They're being a burden on the rest of the world. And that, I think, will lead us into even greater conflict if there's a change of power in Washington. But I think it's rooted in this fundamental difference of view of what the state is there for and the role of subsidies and all that. So I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I mean, we hear from Secretary of State Blinken being in China and being accused of speaking in two tongues about seeking greater and better relations with China. But at the same time, of course, the US is preparing economic steps against China. It's really causing the Europeans big difficulties because they rely much more, I think, on China as an export market than the US, and also, of course, as a trade partner on imports. And it's adding to this sense that I felt during the spring meetings that, really the big powers kind of have started to talk past each other to some sense. Yeah. And I don't know how it's going to play out, I have to admit, but I don't think there's going to be any way the Chinese will stop subsidizing some of these companies. Europe and the US will probably try to raise tariffs and keep them out in other ways. But, the Chinese economy is still a big juggernaut. And to some extent, it's helpful, as you yourself said a couple of times, also in last week's interview with Alexis Crow, which was really good. Is there really a problem if China supports a lot of green technology to the world that everybody needs? One can have different views on that. I think that Western countries, the liberal democracies, still want to have some capacity left to do it themselves, because being dependent on another country has, especially in this time of geopolitical strife, has been risky, and the Russians just see it from the other way around. So there is a trend toward onshoring, reshoring, and that applies to all kind of sectors. And I don't see a way out right now, but it's a problem, as we know. And this deflationary impulse from China may be with us, but so is probably a somewhat inflationary impulse from the US, given what they do on fiscal policy, which probably the Chinese will tell them, well, bring your house in order first, I could imagine.
Martin, do you feel that the U.S. Treasury's line of argument on overcapacity would be something that the IMF would be sort of forced to take up, and there would be, in their articles for consultation with China or elsewhere, this issue will become something that the IMF staff adopt?
The IMF, that falls under IMF surveillance, right? Because they're not a trade organization, but of course they're responsible for exchange rates and the like. The IMF surveillance has not been its strongest suit, unfortunately, in recent years, the last 5 to be precise, because the focus was elsewhere. And if you have a business model where you need the big countries to provide funds for lending to small economies and poor economies, then you don't want to go up against your biggest contributors. And, I've been really disappointed by the way, in general, that the fund has handled surveillance in recent years. It's been surprising that they've come back to these spring meetings by talking about the global economy almost exclusively in the curtain raiser, almost without mentioning climate. Mm-hmm. It's not that climate isn't important, but they focused not enough on what they were supposed to do. So whether there's guts in the IMF to take on China on this one, we'll see. I think the recent staff reports have not been bad. But on this particular issue, we'll have to see. The key report here, if you ask me, is the so-called external sector report in June or July, where they go through global current account imbalances, where they look at exchange rate valuation, and where they come to a judgment whether there is some policies that need to be adjusted. I would imagine that the pressure from across 19th Street from the Treasury is big on writing something. We'll have to see. I mean, as an economist, I would say, as someone who's grown up in market economies, I would say, well, of course, China is doing something that's patently unfair from a Western sense of the world. But whether China is listening is a different story. So I would hope that the IMF is clear on it. They at least the China reports have been pretty good in the last few years. But whether the institutions comes up with a tough call that gets through its board, we'll have to see. Mm-hmm. I think there's ample evidence that China is hurting in some areas competitors. But that's one part where we'll have to see whether the fund is really still powerful enough to send unpleasant messages to its members. And it has to be matched by messages on the US, which they've started.
That's right. So I want to talk a little bit about the US, but I'll start by referring something on the international front, which is that there was this US, Korea, Japan trilateral finance dialogue right during the beginning of the IMF meetings. And the communique they issued, I thought it was interesting because normally these are rather pro forma importance of cooperation and that sort of stuff that is mentioned. But in this one, there was explicit mention of the recent weakness in the yen and the won. So clearly, even at the rather so almost like diplomatic level, the exchange rate issue is now coming to the fore. So let me reverse it around and say that, we could talk about yen and won later, but the US dollar. I mean, what's your sense of the US dollar valuation? And what do you make of currencies like yen and won weakening sharply? I mean, are they just corollaries of one another, or it's about US being relatively so much stronger than the rest of the world? They can absorb high interest rates and maintain a US strong dollar, and it is the problem for the rest of the world, not a problem for the US.
Well, problems in the rest of the world also come around usually because cheaper exchange rates also mean that not cheaper, but these kind of valuations of the exchange rate means that competitors will become more competitive.
Yeah.
And the US economy will become less competitive. So at some point, there's going to be some further widening of the deficit in the US and some complaints about How could other countries undercut them? Again, this would become a big problem if you think about the next administration being from a different party, because then economics doesn't play such a big role. It's the numbers, and how can they export so much to us out of a sudden, right? The problem will then be that fiscal policy will probably not be tightened. It's rarely the case under populist governments. We're already talking about new tax cuts under a Trump administration, possibly, or an extension of current tax cuts. So right now, to be honest, if one is a member of a liberal democratic state like Japan and Korea are, they will understand that the US right now, especially the Biden administration, is not going to commit political suicide by kind of talking about, tax rises or expenditure cuts and the like. So I think everybody needs to, understand that right now the focus of the Biden administration is exclusively on November, and you can see that in other measures as well. I mean, they came up with steel and aluminum tariffs on the Monday of the spring meetings, a great move to get people all excited about multilateralism. But, they have elections to win, and these elections, in a way, are critical for what's going to happen, not just the next 4 years, but much longer. What's happened to the geopolitical developments around the world. It's a question, I don't want to say of war and peace, but it gets increasingly up there if you have someone who is reasonable in the White House. I mean, there's going to be some talk. They'll think about how to respond on monetary policy in these countries, I'm sure. But it's going to play out to the disadvantage eventually of the US if there's some export competition that's heating up. And then, it plays in the hands of those who want more tariffs. But that's a bit down the road, I think. For the moment, I think the countries will have no choice but to keep up with it. The Fed is, I think, in my view, right not to play politics. So they need to focus on their mandate, which means they may not cut anytime soon. Who knows how long it's going to take? And other countries will have to accommodate it. I mean, it's not their fault, obviously, but if Japan and Korea feel that their inflation targets are being threatened, well, they need to raise rates, and it's going to be unfortunate. But let's talk again in a year from time when there's the same administration still, and then kind of getting really worried about fiscal trends, which are clearly on a path in the US that can't go on much until after once the elections are over.
Right. I mean, I never thought that I would see $1 trillion interest payment on the U.S. fiscal accounts in 2023, 2024, but that's where we are at. Martin, you spent a number of years covering Japan. I had the pleasure of working with you in Japan, so I will sort of, end the Asian discussion with a little more discourse on Japan. It's a pretty remarkable situation where, we had decades of deflationary dynamic and unconventional monetary policy, and now we have the makings of inflation beginning to become an issue, but more importantly, that extremely weak yen at any sort of reasonable measure, one would say it's substantially undervalued. What do you think of, BOJ and Governor Ueda? I mean, does it make sense for them to, be fairly aggressive on monetary policy? Because you and I remember 23 years ago, Japan tried to normalize monetary policy, and it ended up being in recession.
Yeah. So again, I said, if they feel that inflation is getting a bit out of control, then they need to do something. But to some extent, it may be helpful for Japan. I don't know exactly the latest CPI readings, but there's a reason they've gone off their zero interest rate policy. Maybe they can absorb a little bit of that. They've become, almost like a post-aging country now. It seems like they've gone through the worst of the aging process, and now I think there were some good pieces on Bloomberg the other day. Bloomberg says, well, the demographics are much worse now in some other countries. Japan is actually not stabilizing, but it's not so bad anymore. So they're over the big hump. And they've been surprising everybody, I think, with their resilience and their inventiveness. And that exchange rate will help their companies for a while. But clearly, there is a manpower constraint, and once that kind of begins to bite too much into wages and competitiveness, I think the BOJ will need to act. So maybe it's becoming a bit more like a normal country. But again, once the elections are over in the US and everything goes as many people around the globe hope, then there should be I would expect some correction on fiscal policy after that, because, there's some very good economists in that administration and they know the trends just as much as we do. So I think these countries will give the US a little bit of the benefit of the doubt for a couple of months, and then we'll see. If nothing happens, then next year will be the time for much more serious discussions about global imbalances again.
So, Martin, in your view, consolidation in the fiscal side in the United States would lead to some degree of curtailing of demand, which then ought to play into a weakening of the US dollar, and that should give some degree of breathing room for the Japans and the Koreas of the world.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, once the Fed is able to start easing rates, I think then things should adjust a bit. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing now is being driven by fears about the unsustainable US fiscal position, right? So 10-year yields are moving very fast again. They hit last year's level, and there's fear that there's going to be more. So, people, some capital is kind of coming into the US and going like, great, we're going to use these rates. Others are more fearful, but I think there's a lot of it driven by uncertainty right now. And I think the things will calm down once we're back into some quieter waters, hopefully. And also assuming that there's no financial accident in between.
Right.
And obviously, the faster things change, the more risk there is that something goes up somewhere.
Right. I was plotting the GDP numbers that came out yesterday for the United States. And of course, along with the growth data and the national accounts data, you get all those different consumption expenditure deflators. The first quarter consumer expenditure deflator and the core consumer expenditure deflator did not look good, Martin. The chart is sort of alarming that from mid-22 onward, you see disinflation going all the way to end of 2023, and then there's a really unpleasant bump up for the first quarter of 2024. So what if that baseline scenario, which I think both you and I would like to see pan out, which is some softening of demand, some softening of the inflation, and then some rate cuts, what if we don't get that, and we have all of 2024 without any rate cuts in the US? Are we then looking at some serious risk of emerging market crisis?
Well, that's a different story. We haven't talked about it yet, because we were focusing, I guess, on Japan and Korea. But and I mean, there's also a possibility the Fed may raise again at some point. Although, and you've talked about that with your counterparts, I think the last couple of times. There are some factors that may suggest that, well, the long-term or medium-term downward glide path for inflation is still there, like housing and the like. But I'm not a market analyst, so you know much more about that than I do. But there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, emerging markets have come through COVID rather well with all the market gyrations and supply cuts and inflation, supply chain problems and inflation. Many have been quite alert on the monetary policy front, tightened early, were able to loosen up again. Couldn't totally avoid a peak in inflation, of course, but I think we're able to manage it in a very responsible way and kept stability and kept capital flows in check. So very good economic management. And I would expect that, some of the large countries, especially in Asia, that they will continue to do very well. They're just grown also so big and have gotten so good at managing their economies that, barring some major shock somewhere else in the financial world, they should do, I think, relatively well. But there's a big bunch of emerging markets elsewhere that may also have been jumping on the fiscal bandwagon, and you may not see it yet, but coming into next year may require a lot more financing, may have to roll over debt, and may not have done this all in the local currencies, and even if so, may be hit by some interest shocks because of what the US is doing. So yeah, the potential is there. I wouldn't be surprised. I've been very worried before COVID when I was still at the fund about emerging markets, and I've been proven wrong to some extent. So I wouldn't kind of cry wolf necessarily on emerging markets as a whole. I've learned my lesson there. But for some countries, it's going to get more and more difficult. I don't want to mention any names, but look at fiscal paths in emerging markets, and then you'll see where maybe there are some problem candidates. Right. And we're not even talking about the Argentinas of this world. Yeah.
Martin, I have no problems mentioning names, but even beyond the emerging market space, going back to our early discussion on Japan and Korea, particularly Korea, I mean, huge housing overhang, lots of debt issue, lots of short duration risk. And if rates do remain where they are in the US for the rest of the year, I do wonder if that makes life difficult for our former IMF colleague who's now heading the Bank of Korea. But you're right. We probably would have been convinced if 2 years ago somebody told us rates would be where they are now for a prolonged period. We would have predicted major rippling crisis in various parts of EM and DM. And so far, the absorptive capacity of the global economy has been pretty impressive.
Yep. No, it's been interesting, right? The big blow up from this tightening episode that the Fed went through after missing it first. Was in the US itself, the regional banks, and then Credit Suisse, of course, right? So that was really interesting. It didn't have any ripple effects beyond that, too much. So hopefully we don't see it now. But the usual rule is, I guess, if something really unexpected happens and it happens fast, like a change in the rate outlook in the US to the upside, that could trigger some more upheaval. I mean, again, you talked about private equity. I think before there's a lot of uncertainty there in the non-bank financial sector. The GFSR, the Global Financial Stability Report of the IMF, looked into it, but overall the assessment was pretty sanguine. And also when you talk to people elsewhere, I mean, there is nobody who kind of rings the alarm bells big time. But we've been too long in this business time, all right? We know that something can happen very quickly. And then everybody says, well, why didn't you see it before?
Yeah. I mean, if only somebody were to go back to the 2006 US Article 4 report. It's pretty sanguine, and then 1 year later.
I think I already moved off the team back then.
No, I was not pointing any fingers, Martin. No. I think there's a different Martin who was involved there.
No, actually, I mean, but it's interesting you bring this up because I would like to see this more from the fund. Look, I mean, back in, I think it was 06 or 07, and I had actually moved off the team, but I did cover the housing market when it was still kind of okay. It was running up. But the IMF at some point called a US recession. And the team did it very deliberately. And they were kind of right, I think. It was in the 2007 report, I believe. They called a US recession. They had to run against some resistance internally and externally. Well, what they didn't see coming was a global financial crisis, but they did see the situation change in the US. And I would wish the fund in general had more the guts of calling out countries on this. It's just too important. And, they can be wrong, of course, but they need to do their job. They need to be led to do their job. And so, if there is a shift toward now a bit more awareness and focus on surveillance at the IMF, if these spring meetings may give you some hope. I mean, the US fiscal deficit was obvious. They can't move around that. But there's also other issues that need to be addressed. And if there's a move back toward greater surveillance emphasis, that would be all the better for the global economy.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of surveillance, Martin, when you and I met in Morocco during the annual meetings last year, there was a lot of chat. There was a high-profile report on the cost of geoeconomic fragmentation. So earlier in the conversation, you've already touched upon that issue that in the name of security, resiliency of supply chain, some degree of nearshoring, offshoring is inevitable. Now, through these meetings, we also saw the IMF has continued to produce research underscoring this. And I think I saw a speech by Geeta Gopinath given in November, where she basically pointed out that all we're doing is lengthening the global supply chain. We're not necessarily creating a more resilient system. We're just saying, I'm not going to import from China, and then China goes and invests in Mexico, and then I end up importing from Mexico. Does it really make us more resilient? So I want to hear your take on this whole geoeconomic fragmentation thesis.
So if you impose constraints on the system, I think by default it's going to be less efficient than otherwise, right? So that's basic optimization theory. Now, has the world found a good way to kind of work around some of these restrictions? It's actually quite amazing. For example, after the Iran-Israel conflict escalated and the Yemenite militias started shooting at the Strait of Hormuz and the whole Gulf, how seamlessly things seem to have been rerouted. Just like during COVID, I mean, it took some time, obviously, but out of a sudden, things kept flowing again. Issue bottlenecks were addressed. Restrictions on certain Chinese imports, can be overcome. So it seems like there is this ability of the global trade network to absorb quite a number of shocks. Now, perhaps that is because we haven't really seen either side engaging in a full-blown trade war yet. And I say yet because, as you know, one of the candidates here in the US has said that there's going to be big tariffs on everything from China, from baby diapers to high-end chips. And what that will do if China retaliates, I don't know. But clearly, there's the specter of more constraints on the global economy is hanging over us. That's why these elections are also so important. How long the system can work around all these constraints remains to be seen. Now, China is very proactive, as you and I discussed, I think, over lunch. Too bad we didn't record it back then. But you were quite amazed by the amount of investment, for example, of China in Mexico, of course, in Vietnam, in all of Asia. There's a lot of Chinese companies that are setting up shop there because that way they can work around some of the constraints. I think this is good because it also means that, in a sense, the globalization increases. More countries have a stake in free investment and free trade, right? Because in the end, it provides jobs in Mexico or elsewhere for people, even if they work for a Chinese company. The Chinese are also actively getting into Europe. President Xi is visiting Hungary, of all places, where they got approval to open up a big, I think it's some IT company. I have to look it up again. It's a huge greenfield investment into the European Union and some other countries also. So China itself is preparing for it. The US is trying to get together alliances on its part to work around this. Everybody's scrambling for minerals and metals and all this. So I think we're still at a point where it's in everybody's interest to keep things going. I don't see any big confrontation yet. If the Biden administration can continue, I think it's going to continue that way. But if political relations deteriorate, then we may be into more of a full-blown trade war. And then I don't know whether the world will separate into different camps or whether the middle is strong enough to tell the big guys, well, sorry, but we cannot decide between of you. You have to continue to work with us, and we have to continue to work with both of you. I don't know. It's an interesting situation, but I don't see that fragmentation is necessarily continuing in a way that allows all actors to adjust smoothly. It can blow up, and it can blow up for other reasons. It can also become much more difficult if Russia has big wins in Ukraine and the whole European situation is different, and Europe starts kind of turning on itself and tearing itself apart in how to respond. It's very difficult to say, but there's a lot of uncertainties out there, and I wouldn't be so sanguine about the future of globalization. So far, about the future of fragmentation. So far, it's been okay. We could live with it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to continue that way.
Right. Since you just touched on Europe, Martin, let's jump over there. Your thoughts on Europe. I mean, we've seen the US sort of, really have a turbocharged, public sector driven economic recovery. And even though yesterday's GDP numbers were slightly below expectations, still pretty strong numbers from there. China, we all know it has problems and is trying to work through that. So where is Europe in the middle of all this?
Well, Europe is a kind of a pretty sad state right now. I mean, politically, economically, I think they're turning the corner slowly. Again, the fund was very sanguine on their kind of recovery. There's room for rate cuts, perhaps at some point, with inflation coming down. But it's the shape of inner European relations that kind of gives reason to be concerned, and it's going to carry through to economics at some point. The Germans are kind of caught in their coalition disputes, and they're not really ready, I think, for big action. The problem with Europe is that it cannot really compete the way it is set up right now with the big guys. And in order to get there, they need reforms inside the European Union. Everybody's talking about the banking and the common banking union, capital markets, and all that. I think it needs more than that. It needs a willingness to not always push your national champions when it comes to all sorts of European projects. Think about European defense. Oh man, it's so difficult to kind of come to some common understanding, because underneath every initiative is always a fight about, so which parts of my domestic industry will benefit from it. So it's also a mindset. Europe doesn't really have a European mindset yet. It's still a number of countries that have kind of given up some of their sovereignty, but they're still very sovereign. I mean, you don't have to be in Hungary necessarily to see that, right? There are some states that are much more extreme on this one than others. But as long as Germany and France can agree on things, which they seem to have difficulties doing at the moment, because they're both pushing their domestic interests first in the name of European action, you will not see much action. So it's not just the mechanics of a common market. It's also the heart and soul of a common market. And, having lived in the US now for almost 30 years now, actually. No, more than 30. It's been more than 30. Everywhere you go in the US, you have a familiar feel in the cities you go. And you could say, well, it's always the same chain stores and stuff and all this. Okay, fine. I grant that. I would love to be a little bit less for that. But the economy is always functioning in the same principles. You know what you get also as an investor. Yes, there's difference between state regulations here or there. Companies want to settle in Delaware still, but it feels like a common market, although people sometimes have different dialects. In Europe, it still doesn't if you go there. There's a lot that has been achieved, no question, and it's been visionary in the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, but it's not there yet. And I wonder whether it will ever get there, or whether it's going to be eaten alive by Russia and China and the US, who all have their interests. I mean, just today there was a big article in the German newspaper about how the AfD, that Russia file party, autocratic file party in Germany, has been influenced by the Kremlin and by Chinese state security. And, these guys are supposed to get a big share of the next parliamentary elections. So Europe is not only kind of still stuck in its partial sovereignty, it's also subject to all these foreign interests coming in, because they're not kind of grappling with how to respond in a determined way. I mean, just imagine the Russians use an outfit called Voice of Europe to get their propaganda into Europe. And the US and Europe have nothing comparable. There used to be a Voice of America that got the voice across and helped people kind of see through communism in the old days, right? Now the shoe is on the other foot, but it's the influence against democracy that's kind of gaining. And there's still no response to that. So I don't see how Europe gets to this point where they agree to be a strong economy that can really compete with China and the US. And so as long as that's not happening, they're going to at some point be either demographically outflanked or simply become less and less meaningful. And then trade will shift away from them because they don't have as much to offer anymore to the rest of the world as they do now.
Right. Europe lacks the European mindset. I'm going to use that quote, Martin. That was very good. It evokes, I think, exactly what it needs to sort of underscore. Finally, Martin, I mean, you and I are both ex-IMF staff. We would like to see this institution, maintain its relevance and leverage. But having these conversations with you and hearing sort of lack of progress in these important issues like quota and not much progress on the common framework either. Do you worry that independent of who's president today or next year, that the relevance and leverage of this institution has sort of eroded? And what would you like to see for that to be restored?
For the last one, it takes always members that are determined to shape the institutions in the way that they were supposed to be. That is not the case right now because I think the key issue here is that there's a lot of stuff going on elsewhere, like in the climate discussions, right? The industrialized countries are being blamed, rightly in many respects, for getting the global climate to where it is right now. It can be measured where the CO2 emissions came from. And the global South wants compensation, wants help in meeting the challenges, and they want money. Now, is this money all going to be used for climate projects and raising, dams everywhere where there's a flood? Or I'm not sure. But the point is, there's this huge debate about helping developing countries that have not contributed to the climate crisis in adapting, preparing. So that's that. Then there's also the pressures on governments to finance their own climate transition, talk about electrification of the grid and all this. There is the need to influence the politics of partners in developing countries that are geopolitically important. And more of these kind of tasks that fall on advanced economies, and they don't have the money for it. Because the budgets are, as we discussed, they're already pretty stretched, and a lot of that has to do with aging and social transfers that relate to health and pension spending. So where's money? Where's money left? Well, look at it. The IMF has $1 trillion lending capacity, $1 trillion. The World Bank needs more, and with the World Bank, we need to leverage private money, right? So the World Bank lends, and then private sector comes in and fills the rest. So I don't think that leveraging is going so well, quite frankly. It's not from billions to trillions. It's from billions to a few more billions at best. But the IMF still has $1 trillion. And for someone who comes from the developing work and to get into the IMF to lead it, it's almost like a kid in a candy store. Out of a sudden, we have all that money, and people are frustrated that they can't use it to the fullest. So the thing that's been going on for the last 5 years has been a steady expansion of trying to get more finance to developing countries from the IMF. What's not so much kind of evolved in line with it has been the conditionality and the debt restructuring that's needed to make these programs work. And that's where the biggest risk is for the institution, in my view. You don't even have to talk about Argentina, which is, how they ever going to get out of that 40 billion hole, we'll have to see. But other countries also get a lot of money. And the problem is also that developing countries get most of their money these days from multilateral institutions. So they keep on lending, which is good. They may not get so much in terms of reforms always, which is not good. And, the way things are going in 5 years, 10 years, there's a risk that countries can't repay their money to the multilateral institutions if things go badly. And then there's going to be, again, calls for multilateral debt forgiveness and, another Jubilee campaign and this and that. And I have sympathy for that, but it should not have happened, or it should not happen that way. If countries want to transfer money to the developing country, well, it has to be grants. Some countries do it, but there's just not more money around. So they're using the institutions right now as a substitute, and it's going to blow up in the face of these institutions. And it's never been good, to see that happen. The last time the IMF went through a huge restructuring in 2006, lots of people left, it was written off, and then the global financial crisis came, and out of a sudden it didn't even have the wherewithal to address all these issues overnight. So it would hurt to see the institutions go down that way again. And for that, we need responsible kind of leadership. The IMF and World Bank, I think, need to be integrated better in a way how advanced economies help developing countries. There needs to be more than just monetary incentives. The Atlantic Council that kind of goes into that a little bit. I think countries need to be convinced to do the reforms right. And the populations need to see that it's not just the West also showing up with money like the Chinese do. There needs to be a real attempt at reform, which can be difficult, but I think there's more incentives that the West can offer than just money to help countries do it. And if it's done in a smart way, the institutions could be really helpful. So I think that the West needs to make sure the institutions function. They need to be doing their jobs right. They should be careful to dilute control at the moment. I don't believe the interests of China in getting more votes at the IMF are so benign. So there needs to be some kind of broader concept of how to use the institutions, and you need to have the leadership to do it, to really make them useful from a geopolitical perspective. Otherwise, we have a multilateral institution that's just been used as a piggy bank, and eventually it will have to be refinanced, and that's going to be awkward. So let's be careful how to use them. Let's use them right.
Right. I think the warning is very well taken, Martin. I share your concerns. We've done quite the trip of the world, Martin. I have to say, thank you very much for your time and insights.
Thanks for having me, Timur. So whenever we meet again, if we meet again, we say the last one we did in our 120s.
Yes, but we're not going to wait till 180s for the next one. We'll do it much before that.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Great to have you, Martin, and thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Spy Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 122 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.